What's up, everybody? I am Charlie Marlow. That is Eric Messersmith. This is a special edition of Everybody Settle Down. We thought we'd try something new here. Eric, how you doing? And look, I was on radio this morning, and we got the news that O.J. Simpson had passed away, and obviously a dude that everybody knew of and just owned the headlines back in the '90s, and really, I mean, for the last 30 years or so, such a famous and infamous character. We thought let's start with just talking about O.J. Simpson and the trial and how it impacted all of our lives back then. I was 12 years old. How old were you when this all went down in '94?
94, I would have been 15 at the 94 Bronco chase time, and then I guess the trial was the next year, 95.
So what do you remember about first when it happened and then also the trial after that?
Well, it's weird because it's one of those things in life where I remember where I was, both for the Bronco chase and for the verdict, which if you think about it, other than, like, major events like 9/11 and things like that, where else do you remember where you were for big events? I mean, that's crazy that it's on that scale of remembering where I was. So I was at a friend's house, we were swimming, and everyone was like, "Oh my god," and there was a TV on their porch, and they're like, "Oh my god, OJ, Bronco chase." So we all got out and watched it. And then in for the trial verdict, I was in school and the teachers just like stopped school and turned it on in all the classrooms and everybody was like glued to the TV. And I actually even though I was a kid, I followed the trial pretty closely back then. And I remember thinking, even as a kid, I'm like, okay, A, his lawyers are really good, like they're really good. But B, I mean, how is this guy not convicted? I mean, it was so clear to me even then as a teenager. And obviously, if you've looked at it at all, I don't think there's any question that he was 100% guilty and yet got acquitted. And at the time, I did not realize. I think I was too young to, even though I knew he should have been convicted and I knew he probably did it, and I felt bad that he didn't get convicted, and I knew it was a historic event. I don't think I realized kind of the repercussions of the racial divide in America and how severe it was at that time, and why the reaction was so split along racial lines, where most, I would say, white people were like, "What the hell?" And a huge chunk of the African American community was literally celebrating the acquittal.
Yeah, that's what's interesting to me is I think about watching it as a 12, 13-year-old and not really knowing what was going on, and then really relearning what happened through. So this might have been, I think it was maybe 8, 9 years ago. I feel like because I was at my previous house. I remember watching the documentary. Remember, they had the documentary and the show that came out kind of near each other. And
Yeah.
to me, so I'll start first of all. I remember, you know, 12 years old, I do remember that it was what the NBA finals. So it was that year, it was one of the years Jordan was playing baseball. So it was Knicks, I think it was Knicks Rockets, and they break into programming. You got the chase, you got Bob Costas on the call. Then they've done a 30 for 30 ESPN documentary on that. And it's funny because when you said for the trial, you said you were about 15 or 16, whatever. The one thing I remember was, you know how it was back in the day. I'm 41. Back in the day when the teachers rolled out the big old stand with the TV
Yeah,
with the
with the TV
VCR.
strapped on it.
Yep, strapped on VCR, didn't know how to figure it out. So I guess 94, I would have been probably what, sixth grade. I do remember. So trial, I was in junior high, and I remember bringing in the TV to watch the verdict in seventh grade, whatever it was, for the verdict of that trial. And it's everything that anybody talked about then. I do remember because my parents were big SNL people, and I do remember like the Norm Macdonald and all the different skits where Norm Macdonald on Weekend Update always brought up OJ. And then just today, as all the OJ stuff is going through your timeline on Twitter and whatnot, they did show the cold open after the verdict where it was Tim Meadows playing OJ. and he's doing like the telestrator on a football game, and the guy next to him is Will Ferrell. But so it's pretty dang funny. People should look this up. So Tim Meadows as OJ is discussing a play, and he's like, "Well, the fullback goes here, and the wide receiver goes here, and the linebacker," and he's doing the telestrator, and he writes, "I did it," and it's really really funny there. So
Right.
what you said though about the racial divide is something that I really didn't know anything about in 94, 95. I mean, I don't want to say nothing. I knew that it was split along racial lines. What I didn't know until I watched that really good documentary, and again, this probably came out like maybe 9, 10 years ago. I can't remember. But I didn't know how close after the Rodney King situation the
Yes.
OJ trial was, and that if you really break it down, black versus white, it was essentially, hey, the white people won and Rodney King got screwed in terms of that huge sensational trial, and this was kind of the justice system righting that wrong in terms of then a black man getting away literally with murder. And I didn't know how much, especially in LA where that all took place, I didn't realize the fervor around Rodney King and how much that impacted everybody's thoughts on OJ until I saw that really good documentary, like I said, probably about 9, 10 years ago.
Yeah, I agree. I didn't realize all the other ramifications and all the backstory. I mean, I knew O.J. Simpson it was before my time, obviously, of being into sports for the most part, but he was one of the greatest running backs, of his time in college and then in the NFL for his career. And so he was a star. But what made him an even bigger star to a broad cross section of America was what he did in movies and as a broadcaster. And he was in the Naked Gun movies, and he was a pitchman, one of the most famous and highest paid pitchmen, and so he became a cultural sensation long before you had this murder trial. And he was a household name, not just to sports fans, but to people who basically everybody. And I didn't know this at the time again because I was young, but there were a lot of people, and you saw this in the documentary. They really got into this how he kind of had separated himself from the black community in order to go more mainstream and appeal more to a broad cross section of America. And so there was some anger there at him. But when it came to the trial, that was put aside, I think, for the black community because of what you pointed out, the specific instance of Rodney King, but more so kind of the legacy of what, to be fair, had been up to that point a racist criminal justice system in many instances, not entirely, but we all know the history of cases where, in the South and in other parts of the country as well, for a very long time, you had many black defendants that weren't given proper representation, that weren't given judges and juries who were fair, and that were convicted of crimes they probably shouldn't have been convicted of, or in some instances given sentences much longer than a white person would have been given for the same crime. And that's just the historical fact of America. And so you had that building up for a very, very long time. And I think it all came to a head with the OJ trial. And there was just enough doubt because of the quality of his legal representation. And if you go back and watch the documentaries, the terrible mistakes and missteps of the prosecution. I mean, they just bungled that case about as badly as you could, not knowing if the glove, would fit or not, and then just saying, "Yeah, go ahead, let's let him try it on." And of course, we all know things you can do with your hand to make something appear to not fit. But that was a pivotal moment, and it illustrated the quality of the defense and the really just terrible performance of the prosecution. Now, with that jury, which was a mostly black jury in that town, in that era, maybe it wouldn't have mattered anyway if the prosecution would have tried a great case, but it would have been nice to find out, right? Also, it was the very beginning of DNA then. And if you remember back then, DNA was a thing where people were like, wait a minute, what? And so when you had, it was easier to challenge it because it was kind of new at that time. And so when people were like, well, there's a one in whatever, 50,000 chance or 50 million chance that this was someone other than O.J. Simpson, people were like, are you sure about that? Now, of course, DNA is so standard that we don't even question it. And so that I think played a big role in it too. If that had happened 10 or 15 years later, it would have been a lot harder, I think, for OJ to get off than it was. But yeah, the only other event I remember in school stopping school for was the Challenger explosion. And I was very young then. That was what, the
Mhm.
mid 80s. That's the only other time that I remember a live event being something that everybody in the school just stopped and stood around a TV for. And if you think about it, I mean, obviously 9/11, JFK assassination, they're on a separate level because they're kind of the defining events of those generations. But other than those events, I mean, the trial and the acquittal specifically were one of that was one of the biggest cultural events of our lifetime. It really was. And imagine, and that was pre-social media. Imagine if you would have had social media back then and it would have been an even bigger cultural sensation.
That's what's crazy is is for people our age, to me, there's not even close a trial that we followed as much as OJ then, now, and again, now that the media coverage is 100 times what it was then. Although I guess the difference is you still had legacy media and they were all covering OJ nonstop back then. Now you'd have the social media and all that. But I think from a pop culture standpoint, and you hate to say it like this because look, two people got murdered, but to me, there was so much pop culture of all these people. Like you knew the names of everybody involved. All these people became celebrities. Like we were talking today on the radio. Kato Kalin. Kato Kalin right now is on Cameo, and he's this big Milwaukee Brewers fan. And he weighs in on Brewers games. And it's pretty fun. It's like, here's Kato Kalin. He was the house guest, right? I mean, Judge Ito, Marcia Clark, obviously Johnny Cochran. Then you had the portrayal of that lawyer on Seinfeld with "If the glove don't fit, you
Oh,
must quit." I mean,
yes.
and I was writing some of these down. Mark Furman, obviously the cop. Then
Yeah.
you'd see him on cable news after that, breaking down from the police perspective, different trials and whatnot.
F. Lee
But
Bailey.
F. Lee Bailey. How about
And
obviously now the Kardashians? You had Robert
yeah,
Kardashian, part of the dream team. It's just crazy to me. Like, if you asked me, I'm trying to think of the second biggest trial in my lifetime because OJ is obviously the first. Whatever the second is, and I can't even think of it off the top of my head, but I have no kernel of knowledge relative to again, like I think almost anybody could probably name 15 to 20 people involved in the OJ
right.
trial. Like, right? I mean, Ron Goldman and his parents and Nicole Brown Simpson. Like you know all the names. And this was 30 years ago. And I don't follow
Yeah.
anything like that. I think that just shows how massive that was 30 years ago.
Yeah, it really was. And it's in a unique position, and but you're right, we shouldn't let that lose track of the fact, or obscure the fact that two people were killed by OJ Simpson. And I do think it's interesting that today, in the reaction I've seen so far, is, people have just, because remember, technically he was acquitted, although he was found liable in the civil trial that happened afterward. And then he put out that weird, was it a book or a documentary where he's like, if I did it, here's how I
Hmm.
would have done it. So I mean, he did everything short of just admitting that he did it, right? And then, of course, he was later involved in another crime, much less severe, where he beat someone up or threatened to beat somebody up. And so I think it's interesting now that people don't even hesitate. They're like, "Oh yeah, this guy who murdered his wife, his ex-wife, the mother of his children, and her friend is dead today." And oh yeah, also he played in the NFL and was a big, cultural sensation for a while. And I think that's appropriate. That's how we should remember him. Like, the first line of his obituary should be, he was a guy who got away with murder. How he got away with it and why he got away with it, as we talked about, that is less about him and more about American culture during that time, specifically in the 1990s. But look, the legacy of those things obviously filters through to today. The way law enforcement treats certain communities and the African American community and the judicial system and a fair and level playing field. These are things that, have been in the news a lot in recent years. And the OJ verdict was, now, God, 30 years ago.
And that's where I can't remember anybody else where it was just like this dude committed double murder, which like if you didn't believe it then, and
Mm,
even if you didn't believe it, it was probably more along racial lines of, hey, we need to get one back. But even now, if you think he's innocent now, to me, you're crazy. But it was nuts for me to see someone for the last 30 years be able to go through normal life as a double murderer, right? When
yeah.
everybody essentially thinks this dude killed two people. And I always thought it was so weird. Like, if you notice in the last like 4 or 5 years, and I hate to admit it, but like OJ was really funny on Twitter. Like OJ was doing these videos and he's like, hey, OJ here. And he would give takes on football and other stuff. And it was just so crazy to me. It's like, dude, you killed two people and now you're just like a normal dude giving takes on sports and life. Like there was even something, I swear, I don't remember exactly, but he commented on somebody else. Like I think it was Aaron Hernandez. I think that's what it was. He gave his commentary on Aaron Hernandez, and I'm thinking, like, what type of world are we living in
Yes.
where O.J. Simpson is freaking commenting on another football player who also murdered people? And I always thought it was weird too. Like recently, so he was living in Vegas and he died of prostate cancer, uh, age of 76. But you'd see he'd be out at a bar or whatnot, and a bunch of people would take pictures with him. And I always thought to myself, like, if I was there, would I take a picture with OJ Simpson? Right? Because like for social media, it'd be funny, but he also murdered two people.
Yeah.
It's just such a weird thing.
It is weird. I would like to think I would definitely not do it, but, who knows if you're in that situation in the moment. I mean, you're right. It was so strange to see him celebrate. You know what it is? One of the trends that I have noticed in recent years is kind of the death of shame for many people.
Mhm.
There is, and he's maybe the ultimate example because, I mean, what is more shameful than, being a double murderer who got away with it? There's, it doesn't get more shameful than that. But I think you see this in much less severe examples as well, where there's a certain segment of our population that's probably always been there, but I think it's larger now. I really do, who just don't have shame or have very little. Because think about that. If you did what he did and you knew you did it and you got away with it, like, most people would be so ashamed that they would just go away and hide. They would be like, I got away with this. It was an incredible stroke of luck that I'm even not in prison right now. I'm just going to like disappear. But not him. He was almost proud of it, which is, you know, we could get into, I'm not a psychologist, but there's some type of, I think, pretty severe psychosis there. But I think so that's an extreme example. I want to be clear, but I think there is a trend of things that normally people would be shamed for or would feel shame themselves for. I think you see less and less of that, in society. And OJ, man, he just did not give a fuck. He was just like, yeah, I did it. I got away with it. Now I'm gonna make jokes about my golf game here on Twitter.
Dude, that's what was crazy to me when I watched that documentary. I didn't remember this part. After he's found innocent, he was like he did this like music video. I don't know if you remember that. Like he's got a big wig on. He's got like the strippers and the women. He's rapping. It's like I'm almost making money off of this. And then just yeah, everything with what happened in Vegas. He's trying to get his memorabilia back. He's got a gun there. He finally does go to prison. No, it's just absolutely crazy. No, I agree with you with the shame thing too, because it's it's not just OJ, but I feel like in sports, like teams that cheat, nobody cares anymore. Whether it was the Patriots, it's almost like if you win, it doesn't matter. The Michigan football, whatever they did, they won the national championship. Oh, nobody cares. I agree with you. It's like if you're making enough money, if you're famous enough, if you win enough, it's like almost nobody even cares about these awful things. And again, this is
Yeah.
relative. What OJ did was
Right. It's
really, really
relative.
awful. Yes.
I think there's a lesson that has been learned by people, and it's not necessarily from OJ that they've learned this. I want to be clear. I think this is a cultural trend that, transcends OJ and maybe even has accelerated. I think has accelerated largely after OJ Simpson, got the acquittal. But you notice now people kind of doubling down on just clearly bad behavior, like not apologizing or giving a half-assed apology that we know they don't really mean, and just being like, you know what? And maybe part of it is a backlash to what I think is an extreme on the other side of kind of cancel culture of trying to make things that aren't that big of a deal into something that is. But on the other hand, if you do something where you are in the wrong, no matter what level it is, obviously I'm not talking about anything like OJ did, but we used to be able to be like, you know what? My bad. Like, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. Now I feel like there's still some of that, but now it's more and more of what are you talking about? I didn't do anything. Trying to defend the indefensible, trying to change the subject, giving a half ass apology. I think there is a general sense that you're just better off denying, lying, not admitting what we all clearly see, or in the extreme case of OJ, cashing in on it, which made him kind of a uniquely despicable human being. And so I'm really glad that, and I, look, this was an easy call, but when you have, because normally when people die, we give them a deference, like even if they did some controversial shit in their life or even some bad shit, we're like, there's also this, and we try to put it in balance, which I think most of the time is appropriate, because when somebody dies, none of us are all of our worst or all of our best. Most people who are public figures who live long lives, who were involved in controversial subjects or issues, they have some good and some bad, right? I think that's fair. That's how we should look at them. But there are extreme examples like OJ where there is no to try to be balanced would be wrong. It would just be wrong because he is such a despicable, or was now, terrible human being that you have to lead with that. That is who OJ was. And then at the end, it's like, oh, yeah. And also, he was an NFL star and a pitch man and all this other stuff. But what he was at his core was an awful, terrible human being who I don't think anybody should be sad other than maybe his family that he's dead.
Yeah, and when we're talking about shame, I lost my train of thought for a second. But what I was trying to think of was, I don't know if you saw this news story from back then. This just goes to show you the lack of shame that even OJ had. So this is a viral clip that's going around now. But this woman is doing a story on OJ, and they're talking about the trial and whatnot. You've probably seen this, people watching, where like I think they're in a hotel room and OJ like knocks on the door. They have a camera crew. And so the woman reporter opens up the door and OJ is pretending to stab her. Have you seen that clip?
Yes, I
So it's
have.
like you talk about no shame. Here's a dude who clearly committed the double murder and then he's joking about it. I mean, think about the reporter too. Like she opens the door. I know she has a camera crew, but here's OJ. He's like pretending to stab her. I mean, this is during a news story. Now, I'm sure it was one of these stupid shows. Like, I don't know if it was Inside Edition or all that. But then the other thing, it's funny you said about just shame and like getting away with things. The quote that came to mind, you remember that Adam Sandler movie? I think it was Big Daddy, where Adam Sandler's trying to keep his kid, and his name is Sonny in the movie. And one of his character witnesses, I think it was like Steve Buscemi or whatever. He's like a homeless guy, and he said so. He goes to the stand and he's like, because they're trying to get custody of the kid for Adam Sandler, whose name is Sonny, and the witness says something like, if OJ can get away with murder, why can't Sonny have his kid, get his kid, And it's just like that. That is what a lot of people think. Like, well, Jesus, OJ gets away with murder. Why can't I do this?
Yeah, and what does it say, or what did it say at the time about our justice system? Like, we all know that our justice system is not perfect over the years, and I talked about a lot of it was based on, how we treated African Americans for a long time in this country, and some people would argue you still do at times in our criminal justice system. Although obviously we've made tremendous progress, and nobody I don't think who's reasonable would dispute that. But what does it say that in this obvious of a case that you couldn't get the right verdict? I mean, this was not a marginal case or a close call. And again, I think there are several factors to it. I want to be clear. Like I said, it wasn't just a failure of the jury. I think the prosecution was, and if you watch that documentary, they pointed out the many, many missteps that Marsha Clark and Chris Darden. That's another name from this trial, by the way, who's here where I live in L.A. County now, running to be a judge in the L.A. County area. I see the signs around Christopher Darden. I drive by Bundy all the time. You remember over and over again, they would talk about Bundy Drive because that was where I've actually driven by the OJ house here
Dang.
just because I was like, I live right near it. It's here, right. I live in Santa Monica. Brentwood is where he lived. And so they have it kind of, they have kind of fencing around it now, so you can't really get a good look. But I remembered it from seeing all the pictures and videos, from the trial. But it's amazing our justice system, which we hold up as an example. I think in many ways, rightfully so, because we do have overall a very good criminal justice system in this country. And there's the old axiom that our criminal justice system is partially based on, which is it's better than 10 guilty men to go free than for one innocent man to be convicted. And certainly, OJ was one of those 10 guilty men going free for sure, but it doesn't speak well of our culture and our justice system that we were able to get such a tragically bad result from that trial.
All right, special edition of Everybody Settle Down, talking about the legacy of O.J. Simpson, Charlie Marlow, Eric Messersmith, O.J. Simpson. We're not going to say rest in peace. We'll say rest in hell. We can say that, right? Rest in hell,
Yeah,
O.J.
I think we can. Burn in hell would probably be more appropriate.
Burn.
Yeah.
There we go.